connected through something that's deeper, the heart, and you don't see it. Okay, and I think why it is profound is perhaps that is the most, if I can repeat the word profound, it is the most profound anti-race statement that we share humanity and we transcend this kind of the focus on how we look. Now, as someone of Indian background, I used to be puzzled whenever the elders, when they talked in Konkani, and they would ask the question in Konkani, what type is the person? They would use the word Zat. And it didn't make sense to me. Why were they asking about what type is the person? Whether it's to do with marriage proposals, and I know there are a couple of Goans here, so you know what I'm talking about. Whether it's to do with marriage proposals, and the next question is, what type is the person? And it didn't make sense to me. But years on later, when I started, as an anthropologist, started to read a great deal about the caste system in India, I realized that the word Zat was from Sanskrit Zata, which translates as being born or coming into existence. And from there, after reading a great deal about the caste system in India, we know that the word Jati refers to caste, and Jatis are combined into different, what we refer to as caste, and they are referred to in India or in the Indian language, in most Indian languages, as well as derived from Sanskrit, and the word is Varna, and there are 4 Varnas. So there is Brahmin, as you're all familiar with, Kshatriya, Kshatriya, Vaishyas, and Sudras. So the Brahmins are the priests, or the priestly caste, and then you have got the Kshatriyas, or Kshatriyas, who are the nobles and nobility, and then you have the Vaishyas, the merchants, and you have the Sudras, who are the laborers and the workers. And with that, you, in fact, have people that don't belong to any of these, and they are the untouchables, the people that do not fit into any of these varnas, and they are untouchables. They are referred to as the Dalits. Now, the thing about this is, what I find interesting, is the caste system was introduced to India, or to Bharat as it was referred to, by the people that had come from the north. It was referred to as Varna in Sanskrit, and the word Varna, which is, as you know in Malay, Varna, which is color. So you can see now the connection between race, color, and caste. And when they speak about Varna, and then the other word, which is Jati, or Zati, which refers to purity. So in the Malay language, orange sejati is pure orange. So purity, race, color, all these things appear to have some kind of connection. Okay, now I use the word caste here to refer to any form of inequality that arises from birth. So I also extend this, as you would have heard just now when I spoke about Wilkerson. She was talking about gender, she was talking about race. So once you're born into a particular race, or you're born as a woman, or if you're born as an LGBTQI, if you're born in a disabled, then you belong. You are treated as someone who is an untouchable and a Dalit. Now the thing about us, I can safely say, because I don't see any white person here, but the thing that you can safely say is that we are all the Dalits of the colonial system. because we're all the untouchables, okay? I'm sure you have lots of different stories about that. You may not be very familiar with the concept of coloniality unless, you know, you are a scholar or social scientist. So I'm sure that you are familiar with colonization, which refers to the claiming of, you know, sovereignty and the annexation of a territory by another nation. You'll be familiar with colonialism, which is the results of colonization, and colonization through conquest, imperialism, and settlement. So you'll be familiar with those two concepts, but perhaps less so of the concept of coloniality. Now, colonialism is the late friend of mine, I mean, not late friend, my friend, the late Patrick Wolf, my coffee buddy, when I was at La Trobe University. And he published a book entitled Settler Colonialism and Elimination of the Native. The important point he makes was that colonialism is not an event, it's a structure. So when we think about colonialism, there is a tendency we think in terms of what we consider that colonialism is something that existed in the past. But many scholars, in fact, have emphasized the important point that colonialism still exists today. And coloniality delineates the afterlife of colonialism. It is the enduring legacies of colonialism. It is the continuing effects of colonialism. It is manifested in a whole range of different things that you see around the world today. The perpetuation of Western domination, Eurocentrism, white supremacy, white privilege. In Malaysia, you find there's always a tendency, the proclivity of putting, white people on the pedestal. Why are so many, scholars, white scholars, being sought after, to make comments about Malaysia? So you see that as one. You also see it in the hierarchies of race, gender, and geopolitics. You see that in the hierarchical and binary thinking that happens today. We see that in the global, we see that in the global, financial, economic, political institutions, the WTO, the World Bank, the IMF. Coloniality is also manifested in, I'm sure you can think of many ways. Yeah? It's manifested especially in the psycho-affective way of how people still are attached to colonialism. Okay? You may think that you have transcended or you've gone beyond colonialism, but it's still there. And sometimes it's not so discernible or it's not so obvious. So, when I was doing my fieldwork among the Orang Asli, one of the things that I was really interested in was to explore the impact of capitalism on the lives of the indigenous peoples. So I spent a good part of my fieldwork and writing and publishing books on the impact of capitalism. Now, capitalism is something that you are quite familiar with, I'm sure. And so I won't go into much details of that. But one thing you know about capitalism is that it supports it and reinforces a class system. Okay? And class, by comparison to caste color, and is inequality that stems from material conditions. Okay? So you have the material and the birth. Now, for all these things to kind of work, whether it's coloniality, capitalism, class, caste, and color, you must have creed, which is a set of beliefs and ideologies. The word creed is often used in the context or in connection with religion. Yeah. But I'm going to use the word creed here in the model that I'm building, as you can see, as one where this set of beliefs and canons, if you want, you know, the various sorts of terms that you would use in connection with creed, to refer to it, the various kinds of beliefs and ideas and ideologies that relate to colonialism and coloniality. So here, this is where I will point out to you that creed also includes development, diplomacy, modernization, the international rules-based order, and I can go on. Okay? And here, what we have is that, take development for example. What we have is the Brahmins from the West going around, continuing what Kipling had pointed out, the white man's burden, continuing the various sorts of policies of colonialism of the past, introducing the various sorts of practices and various sorts of ideas that relate to modernization, and they use the word catch up with the West. And these are the Brahmins who, in fact, have been spawned by the various institutions, the meetings, the Bretton Woods, the Washington Consensus, Mont Pelerin, and they are, in fact, implemented in the various sorts of ways, like the structural adjustment policies by the IMF. So the Brahmins continue the domination through these various concepts. And you cannot impose the creed without the state. And here, if I can get my computer to come on. And here you have, I found the statement by So here I found a statement by an indigenous writer by the name of Ida Denevit in her book published this year, entitled Resisting Racial Capitalism. And she rightly observes, the state is a relation of violence that is central to upholding and entrenching racial capitalism across the world. And the point I want to make here is that however one thinks or conceptualizes the nation, whether it's an imagined political community, as Benedict Anderson is contended, or produced out of difference by, as in the view of Pata Chatterjee, or it is created as, in the sense of the spirit, in the Hegelian sense, or whether it's out of contract, or whether it's exclusionary or inclusionary, more fundamentally, as Denevit has pointed out, reminds us, the state is racializing, gendering, hierarchy producing. It creates, maintains, and polices the hierarchies and stratifications that state needs to successfully exploit, extract, expropriate. So if we start to conceptualize the state that way, and what we have here in the model that I have been working on, is the tyranny of the seven seas. And it is this tyranny that rules our lives. Now, I have a cognitive disorder, I should confess now. I'm obsessed with what we call totograms. So you will see as we progress, I have a lot of words that all begin with the same letter. So here's the seven seas. Now, and this is my analysis of the connection between the different seas. The pivotal seas, coloniality and capitalism. I'm not in any way suggesting that coloniality has actually led to capitalism, neither am I saying that capitalism is the one that spurred coloniality, but they work very closely with one another. All seas are structurally, not simply contingently, linked. They are aggregated. They are kind of like a weave, mats. And they are mutually reinforcing. And inherent in each of the sea is a discernible classificatory structure that is hierarchically ordered. Okay, so now you can see where I'm leading to. If you're going to heal, or however you want to put it, these are the things that we have to focus attention on. Hierarchically ordered. It undergirds the superiority, inferiority, complex, and relations of domination and subjugation. So, if you are in any part of the world, if the country still is hierarchically ordered, it's still focused on one group of people claiming to be superior to another group, if you still have a society where the focus is on supremacy, then my contention is very straightforward and simple. It is, following the colonial logic. And all these, if you go back to the coloniality and capitalism, is hegemonic. Hegemonic in the sense that they begin to control our thinking to such an extent that we cannot think beyond that. And it becomes almost like the words that we use. This is common sense. It's natural. Why are you questioning it? And that's why it's so powerful and hegemonic. So we need to look at ways of how we counter that kind of hegemonic control on our thinking. It is Eurocentric, it's universalist. So if it's universalist, so we look for ways of how it can be pluriversal. And it's exceptionalism in the sense that the West is often considered to be exceptional. It is also represents the natural order of things. And Tina is there is no alternative, as Margaret Thatcher once famously had said. Why are you thinking about alternative? Because there's no other alternative. Capitalism and the various structures it establishes is that's just natural. It's just part of our life. The relationship with the COVID virus is that it is mutable. It's mutability and the mutations. So colonialism may have ended as some might think, that we had development and modernization. As Harry Truman in 1949 in his inaugural speech, with a stroke of a pen, he said that the rest of the world are undeveloped and underdeveloped. And we, as colonial people, we were very fortunate enough to go up the ladder. We were once thought of as savages, but now we are underdeveloped or undeveloped. So, you have some mutations. And once you have critiques like, Marxist scholars really start to question modernization theory or development theory, and when we focus on those questioning, then you come up with much more insidious ways of continuing the domination and control. So neoliberalism, for the last 30 years, we have lived under, this kind of neoliberal logic. So the mutations continue, and the mutations just keep, going on. Just like the COVID virus. You think that you have stopped it? No, you get other viruses that emerge, and they become, increasingly virulent. Okay, so if you think I'm not advertising curry I'm just going to give you one example of how the virus. So, curry meat, right? Penang. When Captain Francis Light set foot on the island in 1786, he gestured towards the ground and asked the welcoming natives for the name of the place. Strewn where he stood were betel nuts, so the natives aptly replied, Penang, is it? So this was how Penang got its name, so the story goes. Welcoming natives. Now, so you start thinking, you know, and as a scholar who is now involved in counter-hegemony, I can't even buy a packet of, you know, instant noodles in Australia because I start turning and looking at the back and asking questions about why is it worded in this way. But that's how insidious the virus is. I hope I made the point, you know, that you kind of agree with me. Now, Nelson Maldonado Torres, he pointed out that, you know, these are, I'm going to introduce you to a number of decolonial scholars. So he pointed out that along explaining what is coloniality, and at the end of that statement he says that as modern subjects, we breathe coloniality all the time and every time. Okay, so coloniality is always there, you know, we breathe it, it's almost like air, oxygen. However, Francois Burgess, whose work I would recommend, you know, much of his work, her work is in French, some of translated, you know, publications. And she says that colonialism, slavery and post-slavery, race and capitalism, and you can see, you know, she mentions the three of the C's that I am talking about, are all about unbreathing, about the toxicity of social, cultural, and sexual and natural environments, about silencing, erasing voices, cutting tongues, forbidding speech, fabricating a deadly form of quietude, requiring mute consent to injustices and inequalities. They play on restricting human lungs and on colonizing the lungs of the planet. In their world, one no longer breathes freely. One can no longer finds a voice. One learns to whisper. It is not the whisper of underground resistance or words circulating from mouth to signal where is the next refuge, the next sanctuary, the cache for arms, the false papers, the hidden routes of escape and marooning. It is the murmur of someone beaten and tortured until mad with pain, when breathing has become an ordeal. So now put yourself in the shoes of the Palestinians. So they have come to a point, not just about breeding coloniality, but they have come to a point in their lives, and you know, very sadly, they're losing their lives rapidly because breeding has become an ordeal. And if you think of the haunting last words of George Floyd when he was there lying on the street to die, he said, "I cannot breathe." So the connection, I think, you can see now that the COVID virus was also about suffocation. It's also about the fact of how we have been asphyxiating, how it is, you know, and the impact of the virus, and that's why we end up, you know, getting to be ventilated. And now, so the point I'm trying to make here is that as you know, the First Nations people in Australia have long recognized, they said that the first pandemic to strike the continent of Australia had come with James Cook. Okay, so that's in 1778, and then later on with the whites invading the continent. And they also referred to as the colonial virus to describe what they were experiencing as the First Nations people. And I've gone further to this, and I refer to it as the six Ds of the colonial virus. There, I warned you, I'm obsessed with tautograms, right?
Can I interrupt? Did you realize you chose the font or whatever that stamp is? It looks like Panadol. The packaging?
Yeah.
So that's for the virus too.
That's true. So the 6 Ds of colonial virus: destroy, to create, creative destruction. I'm sure you can think of many different cases and examples, not just of the past, but ongoing at the moment. Gaza is all about destruction, creative destruction. Dehumanize to exterminate, whether it's to do with indigenous peoples that have been dehumanized, and you dehumanize fellow humans in order to exterminate, as my friend Patrick Wolf spoke about settler colonialism and the extermination of the native. How much time do I have?
You're right.
Carry on.
Okay. And then you have, genocide and slavery. To dispossess in order to possess, settler imperialism, okay, going back to 1492 onwards. To displace, to settle, settler colonialism. To divide and rule. Today, in all the countries that have been colonized, we are afflicted by this sickness of dividing the country, the continuation of that sickness. Political, economic, social subjugation of the colonized through the fragmentation and separation of its populace, to delude, to dominate. And the delusion is something that Franz Fanon refers to it as cognitive dissonance, to the extent that the colonial powers and the ideologues have deluded people, and this is to maintain its hegemonic control, white supremacy, white exceptionalism, white privilege, white savior. So you find that various NGOs that come from funded by the West, these NGOs you see white saviors going right around the world to Africa to save the Africans. Yeah? And so that's the connection with the delusion that I would refer to. So, why decolonizing for regenerative? Why is it in quote marks? In recent years, everyone has been saying to me, you've got to decolonize. And then I started to think, I said, but I have been thinking about coloniality and the impact of colonialism for a very long time, but we used the word anti-colonial at that time. And then I started to think about it, and I should confess that I come from a Marxist perspective, okay? So you have today, everyone has, as my friend Leon Mosavi, right? And he has written a wonderful paper jumping on the decolonial bandwagon. So everyone today, they want to decolonize this, decolonize diet, decolonize arts, and they keep on going. And so decolonize has become an intellectual fad. It's an academic fashion. You get funding if you have the word decolonize in your application for grants. And I find that really problematic, as several indigenous peoples have raised, like Eve, Tuck, and Wang. They point out that decolonize has become a metaphor for multiculturalism, has become a metaphor for diversity, inclusion, and equity, and all these different projects and programs. And it has become to a point where decolonizing has been, in a sense, diluted from the important political project of people who have been colonized. And it has been hijacked by various, groups and people. And this is why I put it in inverted commas. The African feminist, Sylvia Tamale, she says that it takes conscious unlearning and relearning to shake off the colonial filters through which we view the world. But why also put inverted commas to bracket the word decolonizing is because, as Vijay Prasad, he says that the only real decolonization is anti-imperialism and anti-capitalism. You cannot decolonize your mind unless you also decolonize the conditions of social production that reinforce the colonial mentality. So these are two of the many writers that have influenced me to think along these lines. But more recently, in a book, edited book by Zara Ali and Sonia Diane Hasbrun, entitled Decolonial Pluriversalism. And they say that it seeks to develop ways of living and thinking about the world by putting all forms of humanity on equal footing, rather than through the prism of some abstract, Eurocentric and exclusionary universalism. To speak of decolonial pluriversalism means to work to restore humanity to the people and groups who have been stripped of it, and thus to make the world truly human. It also means opening up to other economic, intellectual and aesthetic practices, to alternative relationships, to knowledge and ways of being in the world. So this challenges the notion of Tina. There is no alternative, that alternatives exist. Now, for quite some time, there have been progressive social movements. I think you'll be very familiar with all this, the anti-colonial, the Bandung Conference, and you have to remember that in the opening remarks by President Sukarno, he spoke about that colonialism is still there, it has its modern dress, okay? And he presents it in such a way that that's why the Bandung Conference in 1955 was significant, because they had to challenge that continuation. So this idea of coloniality, the enduring legacies and the continuing effects, is not something that's new. It's not something that recent scholars are thinking about. Sukarno in his speech in 1955 has already talked about the continuing legacies of colonialism. And he even used a strong word like colonialism is evil. So I'm just going to give you very briefly, because I know time is the essence. Even though if I'm truly being a colonized person, time shouldn't matter. I have been banging on this for the last 15 years. Okay, so forgive me for those who know me well. I taught a course for 14 years at the university, Universitat Joan Primo in Spain. And I was invited to teach a course on sustainable development and environment, sponsored by the UN. And that was in 2008. It was the first time I was invited to speak. The person who invited me, a professor at the time, I said to him, look, I'd be happy to teach this, but I don't think I'd be the right person, because I'm going to tear sustainable development, the whole policy and the concept, and the sustainable development goals to pieces. And he said, that's fine. So for 14 years, I've traveled all the way to Spain for one month, teaching a course entitled Sustainable Development and Environment, and spent 14 years or 3 weeks of intensive course dismantling sustainable development. I won't go into the details of this for the sake of time, but I can send you the link to some of the things that I've written on this. Some of the ways of addressing the problems that relate to environment and poverty. The interesting thing about sustainable development is that one of the first goal, no poverty, in 1949, Truman, we're going to eradicate poverty. And then we go on all these decades, and in 2015, they're still up to eradicating poverty. And then you have a group of scholars that have come up with the principles of degrowth. Then, I won't go into the details of that, but please ask me if you would like some clarification. And then there's another group that I'm associated with, and this is to do with social and ecological regeneration. And they are focusing, because the word sustainable means to keep things as they are. And the question that these ecologists ask is, can we do that? Because, the various problems with the environment, with climate change, we cannot keep things as they are. We need to have very kind of clear ways of detaching ourselves from that destructive, economic systems. And that's the regenerative, agriculture that, we are connected with. However, all these various kinds of ways of addressing the key problems, they tend to also come from the West. So degrowth, regenerative, they come from Western sort of institutions. But the other thing I found was that much of all what they have presented, in fact, are derived, they have been borrowed, loaned, whatever word you want to use in connection to this, from indigenous peoples. So I knew about regenerative agriculture, not in the last 5 or 6 years with such institutions, such groups coming together. But I learned about it when I was living with the Samai, with the Orang Asli. So indigenous peoples have been practicing regeneration, regenerative agriculture, regenerative ecology, whatever name you want to call it. They have always been concerned about the environment because they believe very strongly that humans are part of nature, and the various colonial systems, humans are detached from nature, and this in fact leads to the ecological rift, which underlies all the problems that we face. So I want to end very quickly because with some of the indigenous lessons that I've gained. Now, I'm pleased to have my good friend Tony at the back there, who is actually, my professor, who taught me a lot about the Samai. But when I lived with the Samai, very quickly, these are some of the things that I experienced in the Samai community. Egalitarian, primacy, community over individual, reciprocity, inclusivity, cooperation, non-competitive ontological relationship to land, ecocentric, kin-centric ecology, consensual decision-making, peaceable, non-violent, non-aggressive. Very quickly, I won't go into the details because as an anthropologist, there's always a risk that I can take several hours to deal with each of this. Now, here's the contentious statement I'm going to make. I did not realize that after all these years, in the 1980s, I was living in a Samai village for 14 months, and it was a socialist, communist village. Because they are, in fact, what they practice is what I've been reading with all my Marx, theoretical work. But here there are people, the Orang Asli, who are in fact socialists. If the word communist has become a bad word, then socialist, yeah. And so this actually leads to the often asked question: socialism doesn't work because there's only one way that you can run your life, which is capitalism. But here you have indigenous peoples. But if you think that it is only my personal observation of the Orang Asli as being socialist or being communist, the other thing I also realized is that my reading of all the members, many of the communist leaders, whether it's Chin Peng, Shamsek Fakeh, Rashid Maidin, when I read their autobiographies, they often, almost invariably, they have written with such tremendous respect for the Orang Asli. And this is the contentious part I'm going to make. Why did they do this? Because they saw in the Orang Asli communities how socialism can work. And so that's the connection. In my extensive reading For example, Lee Markle, in her book, she's a Native American, I Am Woman, a Native Perspective on Sociology and Feminism. She says that I firmly believe that the philosophy of my ancestors lines up quite tidily with the philosophy of communism. So here she said, I make no apology for my principles. So, let me repeat this. I firmly believe that the philosophy of my ancestors lines up quite tidily with the philosophy of communism. And I make no apology of the principles. In my extensive reading, this is just a few of the books that I've read in the past several months. In all these books, most of them, I've read a lot of books by Native Americans as well as several Maori scholar activists who have become very close friends of mine. Red Alert by Daniel Wildcat. You go Mohawk Interrupters. You go all right to Red Pedagogy, Red Skin, White Mask, as we have always done. Simpson. It's all about the various sorts of socialist principles that we're talking about. So, where does this lead us to? Okay, the tyranny of the seven C's. In my own research, I related capitalism to what I've referred to as the trauma of the 10 Ds. Dispossession, displacement, decimation in terms of the population, despoilation of their environment, the disease that spread among those communities that were introduced by the outside world, discrimination, deprivation, dependency on states, disempowerment, and dejection, and the high level of suicide, toxic abuse. One can see the relationship between the trauma that they've experienced, intergenerational trauma. But the wonderful thing about indigenous peoples, and I know that they have the scars of colonialism that has affected them and has led to this intergenerational trauma. The wonderful thing is that they are here, they still exist. So for 500 years, the West and the Europeans have tried to wipe them out, to exterminate them, to exterminate to set up settler colonialism and the extermination of the native. They have not been successful. So what is it that we can learn from them? How have they been able to survive? Not just survive, but thrive. And for me to go into the details, it's going to take me several hours. But I'm just going to end with the 3 R's of the transformation. So you can start thinking on your own about this, but I'll be happy to answer questions that you might have. To resist the refusal of the colonial logic, to dismantle it. And then once we do that at a critical level, the next thing we do is we rebuild. We go back and we look at our own cultures and our own ways of living, our ways of thinking, our ways of knowing, our ways of relating, our ways of acting. And then resurgence. Indigenous peoples right around the world speak about resurgence. And from there, we have rejecting, reversing, reclaiming, reparation, as indigenous peoples right around the world engage in political activism in order to rebuild their lives. And remembering in terms of history, rediscovering the value of our past, of our own heritage, of our traditions, restoring the word tradition was a dirty word among those who come to modernize us. We need to recuperate, revive them, and to reconstitute them as part of our lives. And resurgence, which is reviving, revitalizing of our own sort of traditions and cultures. And the most important thing is to regenerate, and in order to allow, to bring the past and the present and the future together by ensuring that whatever that we are our past, our various traditions, we can now regenerate these. Okay, and I'll end there, and I'll be happy to answer to any questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Gomez. Thank you for the talk. Please have some tea also. A very interesting talk. I listened from the first second to the final second. Many interesting slides. Even with the Penang Curry slide for students here, even with that slide alone, you can get a very good dissertation out of it from that line of analysis. It's fantastic. So we actually have some questions already sent in through the registration form, but we thought it would be better if we can have a live Q&A. So if you have any questions, students or not students, any questions? Yes.
Thank you, Albert. I enjoyed it very much.